Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's April 2021, and you're listening to episode 232, which is a discussion about answering the question, who made God? On this episode, I'm joined by Robert Keith Loftin, who has been teaching philosophy, theology, and Christian apologetics for more than a decade. He has a master's in philosophy, theology, and the humanities, and his PhD in theology is from the University of Aberdeen. Keith has written an effective evangelism article for the Christian Research Journal, and his article is called, But Who Made God? And you can read his article for free at our website, equip.org. Keith, it's good to have you on.
Thanks a lot. I'm excited about the opportunity.
Well, I'm talking to Keith today about one of the articles he wrote for us a couple of years ago, and what his article addressed is the question, who made God? Which seems like a very strange question. To me, it seems like one of those questions you get like, did God make a rock so big that he couldn't move it type of thing? So I really want to start by asking you, first of all, why is this a question? In other words, who asks this kind of question and why do they? And is this like a serious question that is being asked? Is it something snarky? Like, okay, if you say God created the universe, well, who made God? And more particularly, why should Christians and Christian apologists, lay Christian apologists, care about knowing how they would answer someone who asks this question?
Yeah, those are all great questions. Thanks, Melanie. I think I started hearing this objection more in recent years, but it's been around for a little while. I do think sometimes it's asked in kind of a snarky way, but firstly, you can never tell for sure. And secondly, as a Christian apologist, it's just, I think, tactically smart to always treat it like a serious question. It's an opportunity, for the Christian to really engage assumptions behind the objection. Who asked the question? The question, who made God or who created God, or sort of who designed the designer? A century ago, Bertrand Russell sort of famously put this in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian. In his sort of infamous The God Delusion book, Richard Dawkins has the who designed the designer argument. He calls this kind of the central argument of his book. If you read Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing, he talks about this objection in his preface. So it is asked by popular skeptics, but also by the sort of the intellectual wing of the skeptic community too. I think they're all variations of a question that tends to arise or come up in reaction to the Christian belief that God is, sort of as the Apostles' Creed puts it, the creator of heavens and earth. Christians all, of course, are committed to Genesis 1:1 that declares that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The prologue of John's Gospel, think of like John chapter 1, verse 3, similarly says that all things were created by him, and apart from him, nothing was made that has been made or was created that has been created. And this affirmation that God is the creator is pretty firmly established as bedrock in the Christian tradition. So I take the question, who made God then, as frequently being asked in the context of the Christian doctrine of creation. Or maybe more commonly, I think it's raised as an objection to certain arguments for the existence of God. And so for the article I wrote for the journal, Richard Dawkins raises the question as something of kind of like an aha moment in his argument, like an objection to one of the arguments for God, the teleological. So these kind of arguments for God, the teleological and the cosmological arguments for God's existence, these are attempts to sort of seek to establish that God exists on the basis of certain features of reality. So when someone asks who made God in response to those arguments, I do think it's often intended to imply that the Christian position that God must exist fails what the skeptic regards as like a common sense test. And on that grounds, the belief in God, they think, has not been established. So that's how I sort of hear the objection when it's raised by the skeptics.
Just to circle back on something you said just a moment ago, you said that the question, who made God, is often intended as an objection. So how specifically is this objection supposed to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think this is the tricky part for people who are sort of on the spot to respond to this objection. You've got to sort of try to make sense logically, don't you, of what exactly is the objection so that you can process how to, maybe take a shot at rebutting the objection. So here's how I understand it. I do think it's important that we understand the objection so we can formulate a strong response. So I think the reason this is a bit tricky is that when it comes to let's call it the who made God objection, it often comes in the form of a question rather than a statement. So in other words, the logic of trying to understand how the question is meant to constitute a problem for the Christian is not really explicit. It's not blatantly obvious. So in my article for you guys, part of what I tried to do in the article is draw out what I think is the logic of the objection so it can be engaged clearly. So here's how I see it. It seems to me the skeptic's line of thought is this. The Christian has claimed that God is the creator of all things. And the Christian, obviously, does believe that God exists. Now, as the skeptic understands it, so I'm speaking now from the perspective of the skeptic, as the skeptic understands it, there are two claims that form the premises of a pretty simple little argument. So premises are the elements of an argument that lead to a conclusion. So if I say, all men are mortal, that's a premise. Socrates is a man, that's a premise. And then from those, we of course derive the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So in a similar structure, I think the skeptics have in mind something logically similar. They would say that they're taking the Christian belief that one, all things are created by God, and second, the Christian belief that God is a thing. And from those two premises, I think the skeptics are deriving this conclusion that therefore God is created by God. Now, I do want to be clear. The skeptic, I believe, thinks that both of these premises are fair reflections of Christian commitments. So their first premise, all things are created by God, I believe the skeptic understands that to be an accurate summary of the Christian belief that God is the creator, that God is responsible for the existence of the creation. And their second claim that God is a thing, I think the skeptic takes to be an accurate reflection of the Christian belief that, of course, God exists. God is a thing. And so the idea seems to me to be that the skeptic concludes that Christians surely must be committed to the conclusion that 3, God is created by God. So from there, if it's the case that, in fact, God is created by God, well, then the Christian seems to face some real problems, not least of which is that it's patently absurd to think that a thing could bring itself into existence. And also, God would therefore be unable to bring God into existence. So if that's the way the skeptic's thinking it through, then you can kind of understand why they think this sort of who made God objection has some real, sort of logical purchase. But everything depends on the question, have they accurately understood what Christians in fact think? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I would like to say that, of course there are some Christians who have held heretical views about God, like Arianism, which is held by Jehovah's Witnesses today. They would say, for example, that Jesus is created. But Christians that hold to classic historic orthodoxy, no one actually believes that God is created by God, right? I mean, help us understand how we can, if an atheist is telling us logically, that's what this means. How do we even think through that?
Yeah, that's a really apt comparison to the Arianism that's latent in some outstanding cults today. Yeah, so that verse where Paul says that Christ is the firstborn of all creation, you can kind of see where, I think it's a misinterpretation, but you can kind of see where someone could mistakenly move from that verse to the mistaken conclusion that Christ was created and is therefore not God. Of course, as you say, that's the Arian heresy. Yeah, so do Christians believe God is created by God? I think that the answer has to be definitely not, certainly not, as you say, the historic Orthodox position, shared by practically all within Christianity. So no Christian believes that God is created by God. It seems to me it's almost ironic then that we do agree with the skeptics' final conclusion, or sort of the conclusion of that argument, remember the conclusion was that God is unable to bring God into existence. I think, ironically, Christians do agree with that claim. I mean, certainly, I don't think that God is able to bring God into existence. And someone might think, well, why not? Well, I think it's true because God not only did not begin to exist, but even stronger, God could not have begun to exist. If you're referring to a being that can or certainly did begin to exist, then whatever being you're referring to is not the God of classical Christian theism. And besides, it's also true that nothing is able to bring itself into existence. I don't want to make this a nitpicky metaphysics discussion, but I think there's some common sense ways that people can realize their intuitions support this. Think about existence. It's not like, say, a basketball game. So in a basketball game, a player can rise from the bench, check in at the scorer's table, and at the next dead ball sort of be admitted or enter the game. In that kind of a scenario, the player on the bench already exists even before sort of entering the game. When it comes to existence, however, non-existent things or non-existent entities are not on the bench, so to speak, waiting to exist. These non-existent things aren't things at all. They literally do not exist. So at the risk of being repetitive here, these don't exist in the first place in order to attempt to cause themselves to exist. I could just picture my wife listening to this later and accusing me of speaking in riddles. So I'm not trying to. It sounds like a silly riddle, but that's the way, or rather I should say, that's why philosophers since antiquity have agreed that from nothing, nothing comes. So no, in short, Christians do not, and I think cannot sensibly believe that God created himself.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Keith Loftin. He has written a effective evangelism piece for us, and his article is called "But Who Made God?" You can read it for free at our website, equip.org, where you can also subscribe to our magazine for $33.50. And when you subscribe, you're going to be able to get access to all the online exclusive articles that you hear about that are featured with those articles' authors on this podcast. But we'd also like you to spread the word about this podcast. Please share this episode on your social media accounts or any of your favorite episodes. And better yet, tell a friend, tell a bunch of friends. And help us out also if you could give us a rating or review at Apple Podcasts. If you go there and you can tell people in one or two sentences why they should listen to this podcast, we'd be really grateful. We don't have very many, and we'd like to build up that library of reviews, because the more that we have there, the more starred ratings that we have, the more that people will find us when they search for this kind of content, because that's how all the algorithms work. So help us to be able to be found by the algorithm and give us a rating or review. And the other thing you could do is give us a tip if you don't have a full subscription in your budget this month. We'd really be grateful for a small donation of $3 or $5 or $10, something like that, to help us continue to bring you all this free content on this podcast. And you can do that at equip.org at the landing page of any one of these episodes. Just hit magazine at the drop down. You'll see Postmodern Realities, and that will take you to the main landing page for the podcast. And thank you for your partnership. So we're just talking about Christians not believing that God created himself, but I don't want to take for granted that most Christians believe that God is the creator of all things. I mean, there are some Christians who would also hold to, for example, Darwinian descent. I don't want to get into a discussion of that particularly, but do mostly Christians believe that God created all things, but not himself?
That's a great question. I think, Melanie, that question really goes to the central point of this issue, this "who made God" objection. It seems to me that there comes a point in every argument, doesn't there, when all the participants need to pause and make sure they agree about the meaning of key terms. I mean, just as a silly example, if you're American and you're arguing with a British friend about what will fit in the boot, you may be quite confused at how that argument's going until you realize they're referring to the trunk of a car whereas you maybe are referring to footwear here in Texas. Two very different kinds of boots, even though the word seems the same. Now, in my article, I took the angle of trying to understand how the skeptic may intend the "who made God" objection. So in other words, I attempted to come at this issue from the skeptic's perspective. Sort of ask myself, why would a skeptic think that asking "who made God" would carry any weight at all? So remember, the skeptic hears our Christian claim that God is the creator, recall, and on that basis, the skeptic, I think, maybe forms premise one of the argument I sketched a moment ago, namely, all things are created by God. Then the skeptic, I think, recognizes that Christians believe in the existence of God, and that's because the second premise of their argument sort of summarizes that God is a thing. And so this, I think, brings us right to your good question, Melanie. Do Christians believe God is the creator of all things? At the risk of sounding a little bit like Bill Clinton in a yesteryear moment, the way we answer will depend entirely on how we're defining the word "thing" in this context, won't it? Remember, in premise two of the skeptic's argument, it was the skeptic who interpreted the Christian idea that God exists to mean God is a thing, right? And so it's crucial that we, I think, pause to make sure all sides, everyone participating in the discussion, agrees about how we're using that word "thing."
You just mentioned President Bill Clinton, and for some of our younger listeners, they might not remember that President Clinton once famously, when he was up to be impeached, talked about, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. So that's kind of one of the famous instances of this. So given that idea of what is the meaning of words, and interestingly enough, we are in a time in culture, in a post-truth culture, that the meaning of words cannot be taken for granted, especially when you're talking to non-Christians. But as a matter of fact, when you're talking to anyone, I think, we need to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing in terms of when we refer to a word. So can you specifically clarify for us, since you've been talking about the word "thing" and is God creator of all things and is God himself a thing, just in a way that would satisfy both the non-Christian who's trying to ask you this question, as well as the Christian apologist who's trying to get to the root of what they're asking so that they can give a defense of the existence of God?
Yeah, that's great. I can't realize I am kind of dating myself with the Bill Clinton reference there, aren't I? Yeah, right. Clearly the word "thing" it's neither theologically precise, nor is it particularly pious sounding word for God. I mean, I doubt that any Christian is going to hear, in church this coming Sunday, the pastor referring to God as a thing. Even if nothing untoward is intended by the word, it doesn't have a very pious ring to it. It's not the way Christians typically would refer to God. So I recognize that this isn't a typical Christian word, but remember, what we're trying to keep in mind in this discussion, and I think, by the way, this goes to your broader point about just rhetoric and contemporary culture. In this context, we've got to keep in mind that we're trying to imagine that the skeptic is the one who has introduced this word "thing" as their interpretation of the Christian claim that God exists. So just to be clear, we're trying to go as far as we can to seeing this from the skeptic's perspective. So by the way, it seems to me that if we can find a way in most of our everyday apologetic discussions, if we could just find a way to use the terminology that the skeptic uses, then we should try to do that. It's not always possible, of course, but I think in this case we can make use of the skeptic's word "thing," and then using it may help us to keep the focus of the discussion on what really matters. And in fact, finally, I do think that we can accept the skeptic's introduction of the word "thing" this way. We can stipulate that the word "thing" simply refers to an existent, that is, an entity having being or having existence. So again, although it's not a flattering term, I do think Christians can agree that God is an existent. That is, in other words, that God is an entity having existence. Now, I doubt that Aquinas would be really thrilled about us talking of God this way, but I do think for that reason that we can allow the skeptic's interpretation of our claim, namely the claim that God exists. I do think we can allow their interpretation of God exists as meaning God is a thing.
So what I'm hearing you say is that in a conversation, Christians can accept the skeptic's word thing as meaning an existent. And so we could maybe accept this premise. It's unusual that God is a thing, because normally as Christians, when we think about Trinitarian theology, we refer to God as a person, certainly not as a thing. But what about, the skeptic's first premise, that we started this whole conversation about the meaning of words, namely that God is the creator of all things. Don't Christians say that? Don't Christians believe that?
Right. Spot on, Melanie. I think you're spot on here. So we've accepted the word thing, as in God is a thing. We've accepted that as meaning God is an existent. But we got to remember, the skeptic is the one who seems to understand that nomenclature, that sentence, as capturing the Christian idea that God exists. And I think, again, so far so good. The problem, however, as you astutely point out, comes when we look to the skeptic's interpretation of the Christian claim that God is the creator. I don't want to put words in a skeptic's mouth, but we're trying to understand what they might be thinking. They seem to think that we're saying all things are created by God. Now, keep in mind, again, this whole exercise is to try to understand, firstly, just where, logically, the skeptic's sort of who made God objection comes from, and if we can, secondly, to offer a clear response to it. If the word thing means, as we've agreed, an existent, then the claim all things are created by God would, in fact, yield the conclusion that God created God. Well, we've already said, though, that no Christian should or really can accept that conclusion. Now, when we look closely at the skeptic's two interpretations of these Christian beliefs, it seems to me that we find that the word thing is really being used equivocally, what philosophers call equivocal use of words. That is, this is what's happened in our imagined conversation earlier with our British friend about the, quote, boot. The same word was being used, but in the same conversation, it's being used in two very different ways. So if we take the sentence, all things are created by God, if the word thing means an existent, then the expression all things would therefore have to mean all existence. And here, I think, is where we find the error of the error of the skeptic becomes apparent, namely in trying to derive a contradiction from Christian commitments. The skeptic has, I think, really misunderstood the Christian belief of what it means to say God is the creator.
But at the same time, I think you mentioned earlier in our conversation, you talked about Colossians 1:16, where the Apostle Paul writes, by him, meaning God, all things were created. So doesn't that verse actually support the skeptic's interpretation?
Yeah, certainly we don't want to try and gainsay the Apostle Paul here, do we? That'd probably be a first for this podcast. Paul says in Colossians 1:16, I love this verse, by him, and here he's talking about Christ, so by Christ, all things were created. So the big question, I think, is whether Paul is using the word things to mean something like any or all existence. In other words, when he says things, does he mean to refer to literally all entities that exist? And here I think we're on pretty safe ground in saying that the answer is clearly no. And throughout church history, theologians have understood the doctrine of creation to mean that God is the creator not of all things in that sort of generic sense, but rather that God is the causer of all that is not God. And in fact, in the context mentioned in Colossians 1:16, that seems to be the whole point of what Paul says in the very next verse in Colossians 1:17. Colossians 1:17, Paul says that he himself is before all things. There's that word again. But Paul obviously doesn't mean the blatantly contradictory claim that God is before God. That would be utterly nonsense. So I think when we clear up the skeptic's equivocation on various usages of the word thing, his argument would be something like One, God brought into existence everything that is not God. I do think that's an accurate summary of what Christians mean by God being the creator. And then we'd have their familiar second premise, God as a thing. But from the claim that God brought into existence everything that is not God, and from the further claim God as a thing, there is no obvious contradiction there. These two premises do not yield the conclusion that God created God.
But I can see some people saying, well, okay, so this claim that all things were created by God, does it even make sense if things are literally everything that exists? They would be like, well, did God make this sidewalk? I mean, if he's saying he created all things, did he, create? I mean, I think they could say, okay, things in the natural world. Is that what you mean by things?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, really. I've got a 4-year-old son, and so we're, trying to teach him the basics of what Christians believe, and we tell him God's the creator of everything, the moon and the stars. And then from time to time, we're driving around, and he'll say, oh, look, God created that mailbox, or God created that train. The question you're asking raises a serious point, though, and it is something that I touched on in the article, actually. I think the answer to your question must be no, and here's why. If created means begins to exist, so if to be created means to begin to exist, then the claim all things were created, and again, we're taking the word thing in this generous way to try to make as much use of it as we can, then the claim all things were created basically means all things begin to exist. Or in other words, it would mean that all entities that exist begin to exist. But here, and I think this is to your point, if you think about that, you'll realize it's a deeply problematic suggestion. Everything that begins to exist has something in common with everything else that begins to exist. Namely, what they have in common is that they could have simply not begun to exist. I think of my son's favorite toy, for example. Clearly, it began to exist, and it began to exist at some toy factory. But we can easily imagine the toy, just not being produced. And the same goes for my laptop. The same goes for you and for me, and indeed for the entire universe, I think. None of these things had to exist. So traditionally, philosophers call such things contingent. We call them contingent because their coming to exist is contingent upon, that is, it depends upon some other thing. So a toy's coming to exist, depends upon some factory workers, and the factory workers coming to exist depends upon their parents, and so on and so forth. But here's the key point, sort of takeaway I'm aiming for. If, as the claim suggests, if everything is contingent, then there would not be anything in existence. This is because for each contingently existing thing, there must be a cause. Again, the factory workers are caused by their parents. But then if that's the case, then each of those causes must themselves have a cause, right? And if we never have some uncaused cause, if we never come to an uncaused cause, then it would follow that nothing would exist. So in short, no. If we try to expand the meaning of thing to include every existent, then the claim that all things were created would not, I think, not even be sensible.
I love that story about how little kids think about theology at that age. I remember my oldest son, who is now 24 and married, when he was 3 years old, we were teaching him a catechism for our tradition. And one of the questions is, what is God? And the answer is, God is a spirit and has not a body like men, except for my toddler said, but you said Jesus is God and Jesus has a body. So sometimes those are the kinds of questions that kids will ask that I think are really interesting. And so I'm just wondering, as it relates to our discussion, aren't there some thinkers, like, well-known atheist philosophers, 20th century Bertrand Russell or new atheist Richard Dawkins, don't guys like that argue that we can make do with only contingent causes? In other words, we don't really have a need for a first cause?
Yes, they do. So we're actually discussing at this point like a very old topic, a very old argument. I'll put it this way, we're discussing really the cosmological argument, sort of made famous by the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas. But yeah, certain thinkers, you mentioned Bertrand Russell a century ago, and certainly Richard Dawkins today, certain thinkers think that we can have a series of contingent causes that just goes on forever. Or this is what philosophers call an infinite regress of causes, an infinite regress that just keep going on and on with no end. I think, though, that there's a problem here. And the problem here is that Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins, we'll just kind of pick on these two by name, they're advocating a particular kind of infinite regress that's called a vicious infinite regress. And it's called vicious because the solution posed by Russell and Dawkins, it seems to solve the problem at one place, but it thereby creates the very same problem elsewhere. Or in other words, as philosophers like to put it, they're just repeatedly appealing to contingent causes there, thereby simply kicking the can down the road. And Aquinas himself responds to this argument or to this point. So I'm going to contemporize Aquinas. I remember when I was a kid thinking this. Imagine you're on a road trip, and as your mom's slowly driving the car along, you're sort of slowly but surely overtaking a train. You're catching up on a train that's on the tracks parallel to the road. As the final train car becomes visible, you understand that its movement along the track is caused by its being coupled to the next to last train car, right? And wait a second, that car too is in motion. But how? Well, it's in motion in virtue of its being coupled to the third to last train car. Makes sense? Now, you may not know how long this train will be. I mean, good grief, it could be tens of thousands of cars long, theoretically. But you don't really wonder whether there's going to be an engine car up front pulling all of the other cars, do you? I mean, you don't, in other words, seriously consider that the next train car is pulling this train car, and the next train car after that one. And it's just going to be regular train cars all the way infinitely forever with no train at the front. Of course not. And the reason for that is because you know that the motion of the train cars, that is to say, you know that the contingently moving train cars cannot be caused of their own accord. You know that the motion of the cars cannot be self-explanatory. There must be a non-contingent terminus, and that's analogous to the engine that's introducing as the cause. It's introduced as the cause of the motion of all the subsequent train cars. Well, similarly, if everything in existence were contingent, then trying to explain the existence of all things would be like trying to explain that the train cars are all moving because there's an infinitely long series of train cars, but no engine. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so does all of this point to the Christian belief that God is a necessary being?
Yeah, that's correct. That's exactly how the Christian tradition has always understood this point. The Christian tradition, in other words, has always held that God is, as we call it, a necessary being. And what that means is that God exists not contingently. Just think of necessary as the opposite of contingent. There's a 2nd century church father named Irenaeus, and he says in one of his writings, for example, that in all things God has the preeminence, who alone is uncreated. It's the first of all things and the primary cause of the existence of all. I think Irenaeus puts this in his famous ancient work Against Heresies. This is really apt on his part. And I think this echoes the opening of the Nicene Creed, which all Christians have always affirmed. The opening of the Creed says that I believe in one God, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. So the idea is that Christians have always believed that God is self-existent. He did not begin to exist. Sometimes theologians discuss this property of God, his being self-existent, under the heading of divine aseity, A-S-E-I-T-Y, divine aseity. That's the fancy Latin word for from itself. Aseity just means from itself. So yeah, to your question, when we say that the existence of all these contingent things points to the existence of a non-contingent being, yeah, we are indeed looking toward the Christian belief that God is a necessary being. God does not simply happen to exist. Rather, God cannot fail to exist. I may very well not have existed, say if my parents had never met, but not so with God. His existence is not dependent upon anything else. And I think this belief reflects back to the prologue of John 1, 1 through 5, among other passages that sort of emphasize God's status as the non-contingent cause of all that is not God. And I think that fact is one of the magnificent reasons that the God of the Bible is worthy of all praise and worship.
Well, this has probably been a little bit of a brain-growing, thinky discussion that I hope people have enjoyed. But finally, on a much lighter note, I want to ask Keith some fun rapid-fire questions. Keith, what is your favorite meal?
Oh, my favorite meal is red beans and rice. I grew up in Louisiana, and every time we go home, my mother has a wonderful pot of red beans and rice waiting.
Are you an introvert or extrovert?
Definitely an extrovert.
Are you highly organized or go with the flow and spontaneous?
I'm pretty organized. Yeah, pretty organized.
Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Well, my natural mode is a night owl, but as you'll know, having children has a strange effect on your ability to practice night owling. And so these days we're up when our son gets up.
But if you didn't have to sleep, what would you do with the extra time?
Read. I would definitely spend more time reading.
Well, thanks, Keith, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
You've been listening to episode 232 of the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest has been Keith Loftin. He has written an effective evangelism article for our journal, and you can read it for free at our website, equip.org, and his article is called, But Who Made God? We'd like to connect to you, so please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man YouTube channel and join in the conversation in the comments section and in the live chat when we have premiere videos. Please follow the Bible Answer Man page on Facebook, and on Twitter you will find us at Hank Hanegraaff, Bible Answer Man, Christian Research Institute, and Christian Research Journal, as well as on Instagram at the Bible Answer Man account. You won't want to miss every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern when we live stream the Bible Answer Man broadcast, hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff at our website, equip.org. In addition, please subscribe to the Hank Unplugged podcast. Hank gets out of the studio and into his study and engages in in-depth, free-flowing, essential Christian conversations on critical issues with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people on the planet. You'll want to head on over to equip.org because there you're going to find thousands of free resources for you in articles and past broadcasts, our podcasts, and videos. And thank you for all the ways in which you partner with the Christian Research Institute.